Welcome to the Law of War, or LoW, Advanced Lesson. During this lesson, you'll examine how the principles of LoW affect Air Force personnel in environments that feature non-combatants and civilians, and the employment of new technologies during hostilities. You will then identify how the requirement to adhere to LoW in air operations is addressed by a meticulous targeting process, with guidance provided through rules of engagement that dictate, among other things, the mitigation of effects against civilian lives and property, partly done through the management of various target lists and procedures. Most of this lesson will focus on how these principles of LoW impact various aspects of operations performed by Air Force personnel. You also learned previously that the Air Force has established the 10 Rules for Airmen, which provide guidance for your behavior during conflicts, and that these rules align with the 5 basic principles of LoW. Therefore, this lesson will more deeply explore those principles and how they affect you in the operational environment. To begin, let's examine the principles of military necessity and distinction, and how they impact operations involving civilian objects. The goal of military necessity is to identify and pursue lawful military objectives that achieve the conflict's aims and swift termination of hostilities. Most military measures used to defeat the enemy focus on the nature, location, purpose, and use of people, places, or things that make an effective contribution to the enemy's military capability. We take action against these things to destroy or degrade its activities, capture enemy facilities, or neutralize those things that produce a military advantage for friendly forces. Unfortunately, there are limitations related to intelligence gathering and analysis capabilities in how we identify the nature and purpose of potential targets. LoW recognizes that a commander must assess the military necessity of what they want to do based on the information available to them at the time, and therefore cannot be judged for negative outcomes based on information that later comes to light. This judgment is based on what is known as the Renderless Rule. Humanity complements military necessity. Whereas military necessity acts as a justification, humanity acts as a prohibition. Humanity prohibits the infliction of death, injury, and destruction not actually necessary to achieve a legitimate military purpose. The principle of humanity attempts to reduce the amount of undue or unnecessary injury or suffering to members of the military as well as civilians. Review the screen for examples. Non-lethal, less lethal weapons. Non-lethal weapons, sometimes called less lethal weapons, have been defined as weapons, devices, and munitions that are explicitly designed and primarily employed to incapacitate targeted personnel or materiel immediately, while minimizing fatalities, permanent injury to personnel, and undesired damage to property in the target area or environment. Cyber warfare. Not all cyber capabilities classify as a weapon or weapons system. LoW does not prohibit the development of novel cyber weapons. The usual legal prohibitions on specific types of weapons result from a nation's own practice and judicial rulings concerning the legality of those weapons. In some cases, cyber operations that result in non-kinetic or reversible effects can offer options that help minimize unnecessary harm to civilians. In this regard, cyber capabilities may in some circumstances be preferable, as a matter of policy, to kinetic weapons because their effects may be reversible, and they may hold the potential to accomplish military goals without any destructive kinetic effect at all. However, cyber weapons must be able to discriminate between military targets and civilians. For example, a destructive computer virus that was programmed to spread and destroy uncontrollably within civilian internet systems would be prohibited as an inherently indiscriminate weapon. So just because a weapon is new or employs new technology does not mean that it is illegal. Whether pursuing lethal or non-lethal effects against the enemy, the overarching mandate is to abide by LoW. This includes the principle of humanity, which requires operations to reduce as much as possible the unnecessary suffering of civilians. The principle of distinction requires us to differentiate between civilian objects and military objectives, and limits airmen to only direct attacks against military objectives. It is not always easy to know when something is justified as a military objective based on the principle of military necessity, or when it is a civilian object. The principle of distinction requires commanders to distinguish between the two. Military necessity may allow the lawful targeting of objects that are not traditionally military targets if those objects, by their nature, location, purpose, or use, make an effective contribution to the enemy's ability to conduct combat operations. For example, in the case of operations against the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, targets included such things as oil production or oil transportation assets, and bulk cash storage sites. As we have seen, the principle of distinction, sometimes called discrimination, obligates parties to a conflict to distinguish between the civilian population and combatants, and between civilian objects and military objectives. Distinction may be understood as having two sets of reinforcing requirements. Number 1, differentiating combatants from civilians while conducting attacks against the enemy. And number 2, distinguishing between one zone combatant force and one zone civilian population and locations. Adhering to the second rule is relatively simple. U.S. military forces comply by having all its personnel wear distinguishing uniforms and insignia. LoW principle of proportionality exists to ensure that combatants weigh the anticipated gains of military operations against reasonably foreseeable consequences to the civilian population. Proportionality does not strictly prohibit civilian casualties. It challenges us to weigh those expected casualties against the military advantages gained. The principles of distinction and proportionality are closely associated. Distinction compels us to differentiate combatants and unprivileged belligerents from civilians, while proportionality compels us to prevent excessive loss of civilian life and property in relation to the military gain. When confronted with legitimate military objectives near civilian concentrations, these two principles sometimes collide. Honor. The fifth principle is that of honor, and demands a certain amount of fairness in offense and defense, and a certain mutual respect between opposing forces. Honor is sometimes referred to as chivalry, and is often associated with the behavior amongst knights in Europe during the Middle Ages. A common complaint among friendly forces is that the enemy does not always abide by this principle. While this may be true, that argument targets the wrong actor. We are professional warfighters, and the enemy's lack of honor only serves to highlight why it is so important that airmen abide by a higher standard. The evaluation process, which determines whether a target is too close to a protected location for engagement, is known as the Collateral Damage Estimation Methodology, or CDM. CDM is a way for commanders to ensure they adhere to LoW by weighing the risk of collateral damage against military necessity and proportionality. The final product of this process is known as the Collateral Damage Estimation, or CDE. CDM is part of the target development process, which starts when commanders begin campaign planning for operations, and is refined during the execution of those operations. As previously discussed, the decision to engage sensitive targets is based on whether the expected collateral damage exceeds the combatant commander's ROE. But there are also numerous types of ROE that constrain Air Force operations. These are the main types of ROE: Standing Rules of Engagement, or SROE, North Atlantic Treaty Organization Rules of Engagement, or NATO ROE, Mission-Specific ROE, Special Instructions, or SPINs, and Rules for the Use of Force, or RUF. No matter who authors a particular ROE, it is important to understand that ROE guidance can be more restrictive than LoW guidance, but never less. Most targets in a conflict are identified and analyzed months, if not years, before an actual conflict as part of the target development process that supports operational planning. Several DoD agencies share the responsibility of studying a potential adversary's military capabilities and supporting infrastructure. The results of those studies are entered into a database, target by target, known as the Modernized Integrated Database, or MIDB. Significant civilian locations, usually protected sites, are also contained in the database, location by location, which contain relevant information associated with them as well. Prior to the execution of hostilities, all targets relevant to a particular campaign plan are pulled from the MIDB and entered into a sub-database known as the Joint Target List, or JTL. These targets are generally deemed eligible for strike in support of that particular campaign. As a result, no target may be considered for engagement during that campaign's deliberate targeting process unless it resides on the JTL. Just because a target is on the JTL doesn't necessarily mean it is automatically cleared for engagement. Due to operational requirements, intelligence concerns, or political sensitivities, some targets may be designated eligible for strike, but with restrictions. These targets are placed on what is known as a Restricted Target List, or RTL. Conversely, just because a target is not on the JTL, for example, not eligible for strike, does not necessarily mean it cannot be targeted. If enemy forces occupy a protected location, doing so changes the function of that location, and thus it may be reclassified to one that may be eligible for targeting. Congratulations! You completed the Law of War Advanced lesson. In this lesson, you learned how to describe how military necessity and distinction impact operations involving unprivileged belligerents or civilians directly participating in hostilities. Describe how humanity impacts new weaponry. Describe how distinction impacts operations against unprivileged belligerents or civilians directly participating in hostilities. Describe how proportionality impacts operations in populated areas. And recognize how the law of war is operationally implemented through collateral damage estimation, rules of engagement, and target lists.